this stuff was all new to me. I didn't have anything very much to relate it to, but I was very impressed by the lecture. And above all, by the astonishing range of dynamics. I mean, when he had an important point to make, he would do it like that, and then he would come down to a meaningful whisper. And this was something that electrified me. I don't know if you get the general impression. That's the best imitation I can give. So I commented on that. I said I thought that was a very effective means of keeping people awake. And attracting their interest. He was insulted. I mean, he brushed that aside and said, I don't want you to talk about things like that. Tell me what you thought about the substance. I don't remember what I had to say. But he did have a gift in these sessions of taking any altering little thought I had and finding something in it that was worth expanding and developing. And this was part of his genius as a teacher, I think. That he really listened to what you had to say. He always found some useful takeoff point from it that made you feel that you had said something, whether you had or not. I could go on more at length about the training sessions, but I guess that's really not so much about David as a person. If you're interested in testing, then well, I'll assume that you are. Just to bring out the fact that the people who were hired included someone like Mike Dunn, who had had years of work with the Rorschach and considered himself an expert, and he had used the Klopfer approach, and other people had been trained by Beck and so forth, and all were told to forget all that and start over and learn his way of administering, his way of scoring, his way of interpreting that and all the other tests. And there was a good deal of grumbling among those who had this kind of background that I lacked. But everybody realized when we got into it that he had a very special approach, which was really based on scientific method. You know, his idea was that the testing situation is a rich source of hypotheses, but it's also an opportunity to gather simultaneously several independent kinds of data. You have the data of direct observation. He forced all of us by asking us questions. You see, each of us would have given one test to a patient. And then we got together for our ongoing seminar, which was several hours a day, every day, to present the test and our thoughts about it. And the first thing he would ask was about the patient's body language, the patient's expression of emotion, the patient's general habits and physiognomy. So we were forced to really take a look at all that. And then we learned, of course, that the test, any test, whether it was an intelligence test or word association or even Sandi, required a certain amount of verbalization from the patient. And you were to listen to and take down every word. And then we learned his technique of analyzing verbalization, which was his own, and something that was very valuable. The test, of course, produced a certain amount of content, and the content could be understood in a variety of ways. Well, okay, I could go on like that, and I have gone on like that for too long. But let me go on to some other kinds of points about David. He also ran the research department, and at first I learned about that through my wife, Louisa, who was a sociologist, and whom he welcomed to the research department because she was embarked on a dissertation attempting to integrate psychoanalytic and sociological theory, which is something David was very much interested in. And he served as a mentor for her. And his way of working with the research department was to have, first was everybody met in a meeting each week and reported on what they're doing, but he would have individual sessions in which he would keep very close touch with how each person was doing. He would do all the background reading necessary to understand fully what they were into, and would make very, very helpful suggestions. I learned about that, of course, when I joined the research department as a worker on the project that he and Carl Menninger had started on the selection of psychiatrists. And he told me at that point that he was also hiring another young psychologist, Lester Laborsky, and he told me in confidence that Lester and I were to work as co-equals, but I was to be the leader. Which was a kind of a mixed message. He wanted me to be very cool about it. He looked to me to take the lead and to organize things, but to do it very discreetly so that Lester didn't know. Well, Lester is no joke. And this was the one piece of bad advice that David gave me as a research administrator. But that was a useful thing to learn. And I guess my time is up. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the trouble. There are just too much to say. Well, okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about how David was a mentor to me. Partly, of course, he read everything I wrote, and he wrote me extensive notes about it. Now, of course, you have to realize he left Topeka in 1948, which was only 2 years after I had arrived, and I was there for several years afterward. So there was intense correspondence back and forth. I read everything that he wrote, and I tried to give comments following his model. And he took all that very seriously. As a matter of fact, when he took on the job of writing the monograph on psychoanalysis for Sid Koch, which was later published in Psychological Issues, the structure of psychoanalytic theory. He produced many drafts of that, and I went over each of those and discussed them with him. And he offered me co-authorship simply because of suggestions I had made and questions I had raised. And that was typical of his generosity. He also gave me many opportunities, opened doors for me. He was at the very beginning of the Division of Clinical Psychology. He was its secretary. And so he kept nominating me to be on committees and to get involved in it. When we went to conferences, he would introduce me to people. I remember once we were walking down a hall at an APA meeting, and he spotted Hans Eysenck making a telephone call. And he grabbed me by the elbow and took me over to Eysenck and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Eysenck, I want to introduce you to Dr. Holt." I don't think Eysenck ever forgave me. But he knew, of course, everybody who was anybody in psychoanalysis. And he had earned their respect. And so he introduced me at every opportunity. And that was he got me into the Psychoanalytic Society and into PICA, really under false pretenses. I hadn't had any training, but I had been analyzed by Felix Deutsch, who was a training analyst, and I had taken a couple of seminars at the Washington School of Psychiatry, and he knew all that up to make it look as if I was a trained psychoanalyst. So I had the opportunity of being an active participant in the society. So anyway, it was also a very personal thing because I went through a variety of personal crises during the years of our friendship, and he was enormously helpful and supportive. And he would tell me about his own difficulties in his marriage. So I didn't feel that it was, totally one-sided. So he did spend his last one year at NYU, and George was on sabbatical, and he took a sabbatical from Riggs, and he was in the next office. And I've talked about that in my memoir, but it was an opportunity really to consolidate our friendship.
In 1943, David Rapaport was looking for someone to work with him as a research assistant, both in gathering data and scoring and tabulating on the work on diagnostic psychological testing. He was then at the Menninger Clinic, but earlier he had been at Osawatomie State Hospital in Kansas. I think it's a prelude to Menninger's taking him on once it got a grant from the Josiah Macy Foundation to do this research for the Army, with William Menninger as chief psychiatrist of the Army. Almost everybody else by then, since it was the war years, had been drafted or was going to be drafted soon, and I hadn't been called yet, so I was available. got to me through a group, probably through Bela Nickelman, who was a prominent Hungarian New York analyst at the time. That was a group that included Gordon Murphy and Lawrence Cuby and Monroe and a number of other well-known people at the time. And since I was a leading student in the undergraduate department, he hired me at the age of 20, not yet having my bachelor's degree because I lacked one course. And I went out to many years, and although I had the experience when I was a site manager in the city that I had died and gone to heaven, the instruction was so wonderful. I had a second rebirth, and many as I died.
Excuse me, just want to give
Excuse me. Provincial working with Holzman, which is extraordinary. Well, Rapaport was the kind of guy to make sure you knew your place. He had a strong European authoritarian slant in his personality. So the first day I was there, he sat me down, and I'm going to tell a joke, only I'm not going to tell it in Yiddish. It's a Yiddish joke. He told me two things. First thing was about a rabbinical student who's invited to the teacher's home for dinner and arrives a little late, and the only seat available is up at the head of the table next to the rabbi. So he whispers in his ear. He says, I don't know where to sit. The only place to sit is at the head of the table. The rabbi says, not to worry. Wherever you sit, it's the foot of the table. Next thing he told me, consistent with what Bob said, he thrust piles of reprints in front of me on testing, this thick, beginning with intelligence testing, which at that time was mainly Stanford DNA, a little bit on the Wexler. Diagnostic testing was in its pre-infancy, I would say. And he said, I want you to learn this, and you have to know it thoroughly. And to give you an idea of what I mean, I'll tell you a story about the Quran. The teacher of the Quran tells the student, when they start, they give them the Quran. He says, I want you to know it so well that if I stick a pin in through the cover, you will know on which word it's written. Because that's how exact things are. So I tried to do my homework. I was that kind of student. And so we got started. I watched him testing. He watched me testing. I watched him score. He went over my scoring. I watched him analyze testing. He went over my analyses of testing. And it was very interesting watching him. When he came across something significant, he would wiggle his ears. He's the only person I ever met who wiggled his ears. And then he would say at the first sign, watch. He still had a very heavy Hungarian accent and hadn't completely mastered the English language by far. So that, for instance, in the Menninger canteen, he liked to order a sick malt. He wanted to impress you with being very careful to look at every inch of the data. So you have to look in every crayon and rookie. We had a lot of fun with his language, but it also meant that while diagnostic psychological testing was being written, he asked me to either revise a lot of what he was writing or to tell me what to write about some of the results, and then he would review it. And then Bill Gibson, Margaret Benson's husband, who was a writer, would revise it further before it went to the press. At that time, Margaret Brennan and Merton Gill were already at the Menninger Clinic for a year or two. And they were doing hypnosis research and working under his supervision. And I was. So the three of us became Margaret and Merton and I sort of became a gang with spouses and a couple of others more peripheral. And he inspired in us such a mixture of feelings that it would be hard to exhaust the list. Everything from love to hate, to envy, to gratitude, to feelings of being invaded, of being over-controlled, of being so thankful for his generosity, being in awe of his awareness, of his erudition, and so on, and of his arrogance, of which he had quite a lot, mixed with, as you might expect, a lot of the attitude of the humble, meek Jew who wouldn't presume to impose himself on anything. So that, for instance, to complete my requirements for a bachelor's degree at City College, I took a course on psychology that he was teaching at Washburn University in Topeka. And I was just so impressed by the breadth of his references and his facility. So one day, as we were heading home after the lecture, I told him how impressed I was, and he shook his head sadly, and he said, "Bluff." Bluff. And that was another part of his attitude. And it's what made him such a meticulous scholar. It was evident later when he was teaching in the New Psychoanalytic Institute, the Western New England. I was in the first class, and we spent an enormous amount of time on the 7th chapter of Interpretation of Dreams. Every line of the 7th chapter was underlined in more than one color, because he re-prepared every time he taught. And it was always a little different. And our standing joke among the candidates was, you can't graduate until you've underlined everything in the 7th chapter, at least once. So, but he expected that of his students as well. He was very exacting, very critical. He could make you feel very ashamed, to the point almost of feeling terrified. In the analytic class, which comprised a number of experienced psychiatrists and me as a research candidate psychologist, with a lot of experience behind us, except for me, who had known him by then for 10 years, he scared the class so much that they did what he wanted. They knew line by line what they tried to, what Jacobson had said about Hartman, about Rapaport, comment on Freud, and so on. And none of them, because learning under terror is not a good thing. None of them ever took an interest in beauty again, except me, who already had an interest. And but we learned a great deal of the basic orientation. Well, getting back to the beginning, I worked intensively collecting data for diagnostic psychological testing, went over it with him. Gradually, he gave me more and more independence. And just about the time the book was finished, I was drafted. I was in the Army for a year. I had gotten deferment for because this was considered essential research. As soon as they started amending the School of Psychiatry, they got me out of the Army on a clause known as for the advantage of the government, which allowed them to release agricultural workers and others and so on. But the Mending School of Psychiatry was considered important enough to the VA that after a year I came out, and very shortly, because his interest had shifted to research, he turned over the testing program to me. Not child testing, Sybil Escalona and others were involved in that, but I was in charge of testing. Marty Naiman came, my former wife Sarah came as interns, and I supervised them along with them. When the Mending School of Psychiatry started, I gave a regular seminar on testing to them. He gave me a great deal of autonomy in that respect. And it was out of those lectures that my first book the clinical application of psychological tests developed. And some people in the group here, I think, were in that group at the time. Then in 1947, the opportunity came to come to Ridge, and I came a year ahead of him and Merton Gill and Margaret Brennan. His credo, or his dedication, was what he called thinking about thinking. And that characterizes, I think, a great deal of his work. And I think it characterizes the work of many of his students, many of whom are in this room, and their subsequent work, even though theoretically a number of us have departed from his point of view and have criticized it because he was basing everything on Freud's metapsychology, about which we developed various kinds of doubts and were called by some heated up analysts parasites and other things because we didn't adhere to a system of thought. But there's a more basic sense of commitment and loyalty, which I think we all share, which is related to this thinking about thinking and striving for exactitude and responsibility in whatever we do. And I think that is the heritage that many of us carry in us, and for which we are very thankful. Speaking for myself in my last word, the downside of that is his influence was so pervasive and so controlling that one had a feeling I had for many years of his looking over my shoulder critically, particularly because he didn't want me to go in a clinical direction, only to stay in theory and formal research. And he was quite actively critical in opposition to where my own interests lay. And so that many years of my life and much time in my analyses was spent trying to get him out of my system in that respect. That was the bad object, Rapaport. There's also the good object, Rapaport, whom I still am very thankful to and reverential for.
Thank you. All right, Paul, can we, what screens are in?
There's one window that goes in there.
All right, Phil Holtzman. Pick up from where Roy left off. First, Roy and I had known each other at City College. We were in the same undergraduate class. And it was great to see him again in Topeka because I wondered what had happened to him in the interim. But just to pick up on that anecdote or his talk about Rapaport as the introject, good and bad. Somewhere in the 1950s, I wrote a paper called A Note on Breuer's Hypnotic Theory of Neurosis. And I sent the draft to Rapaport because he had told me that he would like to see everything that I was writing. And so I sent it to him, and he sent back a letter telling me that it was a nice paper, but, oh no, I'm sorry, the story is that it was already published. And then he read the paper, and he sent me back a letter saying it was a very nice paper, but if I had sent him a draft before it went to the editor, I could have saved myself the embarrassment of neglecting the Alles and Teller reference, which was notoriously missing from this. That was the sort of thing that he would do typically. He would breathe down your neck. And there were many times that you wanted him to do that. Now let me go back in time, because that was the 1950s. And I was in the Army waiting to get out, and I was in the Pacific Ocean area, and I didn't know what the hell I was going to do when I got out. I knew I wanted to continue in psychology, and so I wrote to my old mentor, who supervised my honors thesis at City College, Gardner Murphy. And I said, what's going on in psychology these days? I've been away for 3.5 years. And he never answered me. But I did get a letter from Margaret Brennan saying that if I wish to apply to the Menninger Clinic for training in clinical psychology, they would be glad to review my application. And that was through the good offices of Murphy. And so I did. And when I got out of the Army, I received a letter telling me to go to the American Psychological Association convention in Philadelphia, where I would be interviewed by a group from the Menninger Clinic. And there I met David Rapaport for the first time.
What year was that?
1946. September 1946, early September 1946.
August.
Huh?
August.
August 46, okay, because he was there too. He was not an imposing presence, except when he opened his mouth. And he gave me the Rorschach.
Oh, my goodness.
And, you know, I had read diagnostic psychological testing in the paperback form, which I was able.
Manual for the Army.
It was the manual for the Army, and I was able to get it. And I thought, this is a marvelous piece of work. And what impressed me was not the diagnostic stuff and the statistics. What impressed me was the rationales, which were deep analyses of thought processes of various kinds. And it stayed with me to this very day, and I hope I'll have time to come back to how it has influenced the work that I do now.
Phil, it's not clear. Did he administer the Rorschach?
He administered the Rorschach.
I thought that's
Yes,
what he meant.
yes, yes.
All the candidates for the school were given the battery.
Yeah. I got the Rorschach from him. Milt Wexler gave me the intelligence test. Mike Dunn gave me the word association test. Somebody else gave me the sort. Roy, did you test it?
I think I tested you, and I think I tested Herbert with it too. I have complete amnesia.
But in his files, he has the report.
This is a man who learned about confidentiality. Well, I went out to Topeka with Ann, my wife, whom I married very shortly before we went out to Topeka. I said, I'm going to take you on a honeymoon to the middle of the United States. Now, there was something extraordinary about this place. Roy has mentioned something about it. It really started maybe 18 months before I had gotten there, when a man named Arthur Marshall, who was Omar Bradley's assistant in the European Theater of Operations, he was in charge of setting up hospitals in the ETO. And he was then given the job of finding VA hospitals, particularly psychiatric hospitals, for the returning veterans. And they were thinking that there would be a lot of returning psychiatric casualties. So he came to Topeka because he had a cousin named Maimon Levitt, Mike Levitt, who was a resident there at the time, and he stopped off to visit him. And Mike Levitt said to Arthur Marshall, who had his colonel wings on, listen, I think that you ought to meet Carl Menninger. Arthur Marshall was also Jewish, although his name would never give that away. And so the two of them, Carl Menninger and Arthur Marshall, sat down. Carl Menninger very much impressed by this chicken colonel. And Marshall told Carl what he was interested in, and Carl got interested. And he said, you know, I think that we could take about 10 residents. And Marshall said, well, we need more than that. How about 20? The bidding started, and it went up to 100 residents. Here were these two enthusiasts caught up with each other, unable to let go of the bidding, until finally they were bursting literally at the seams, and they could take no more than 100. Plus, I think there must have been 17 or 18 clinical psychology trainees that were thrown into the pot to sweeten it with a little intellectual ferment. Well, that was the start of the Menninger School of Psychiatry, and Arthur Marshall just took off his uniform at that point and joined as a first-year psychiatric resident in the Menninger School of Psychiatry. And Roy was the teacher. Carl was a teacher. Will was just coming back from the Army. David Rapaport taught. The cast of characters was marvelous. We were taught diagnostic psychological testing as if this were the course in psychology. We went into cognition, we went into motor behavior, we went into visual motor coordination. Everything that you can imagine was poured into this course by Rapaport himself. And as Roy described it, you really had to know this stuff. And if you didn't know it, he would shame you in front of the class. To give you an example of what I mean by shaming, he gave an exam, and he came in with the papers graded, and then he would tell us how terribly we did. What an awful performance this was by the entire class of 16. But he was going to read the best two answers to this. And he took out paper, he started to read it, and every line he would criticize how awful this was, but this was the best. He was, with us, very stiff, very formal. He would call us Mr., and we had to call him Dr. Rapaport. I remember that the chief of psychology was a man named Robert Chalman, and he once proposed to Rapaport why don't we call each other by our first names? And his answer was, Dr. Chalman, I prefer that you address me as Dr. Rapaport. Yes.
He called me Mr. Schafer for a year, even though we spent hours together every day. And only later, and very shyly, did he propose to me, perhaps you could begin calling me David. Which was, very...
Let me give a codicil to that. He came back to Topeka to visit, and Herb and I had dinner with him at our house. Ann served a wonderful dinner. And at the end of the dinner, he said to me, I still called him Dr. Rapaport, and he still called me, now it was Dr. Holtzman, I had a PhD. He said, do you have any brandy? I had given him wine with the dinner. I thought, this guy is a secret drunk. So I took out the best bottle of cognac that I had, bootlegged from Kansas City. And he says, could you pour 4 glasses?
Topeka was dry.
Yeah. Pico was dry. You had to bootleg it.
They got it from Mississippi.
And so it were 5 glasses, and he said, I would like to propose a toast to our friendship. He says, I would like for you to call me David. And then what could we say, Herb? Right? We said, please call me Schnorrer, or what, you know.
Where did DR come from? I thought you all called him DR.
No, we never called him DR. We never called him.
No?
No. We did want to send him to law school, and we did want him to go into the shoe business or something like that, but we never did. That was entirely disrespectful. When he taught, he would speak in long Germanic Hungarian sentences. I took down one of these, and it was a paragraph long, really. And so sometimes it was hard to get to the meat of what he was going to say, because the meat usually came at the end, but the introduction, you know, in these troubled times one must pause to reflect and so on. The place of the case conferences was also a remarkable thing. Roy and Bob experienced it much more than Herb and I did, but the resident would present a case, and usually these took about 25 minutes to read, and carefully done analyses of the family structure and psychopathology and so on and so forth. Then he would come up with a tentative diagnosis, and then they would go around the room like a minuet, with the lowest status psychiatrist going first, and up to maybe Bob Knight or Carl Menninger, or Merton would be before them. And then afterwards, he would turn to the psychologist for the psychological test report. It could be Roy, it could be an intern. It didn't matter. And the diagnosis was forthcoming there. Mostly if it was a psychosis on the basis of thought disorder. And that settled it. Such was the importance of David Rapaport to that institution, that he revolutionized how one came upon a diagnostic conclusion. Now,
Psychiatric residents would sometimes try to get a hint ahead of time of what you were going to say in the test report, so that he wouldn't be shown up.
that's right. And one of the tragedies, I feel, is that because the Menninger Clinic was not in the university, that kind of cumulative knowledge that's passed on to students it essentially was lost on the psychiatric world today, where the Rorschach sort of degenerated into a tea leaf reading.
You should know that Roy did that at Yale as well. When he went to the case conference at Yale in the 60s, they talked around the room and they finally turned to Roy and they said, tell us what the truth is.
Yeah.
Of course, that's how things were, that's how things had been at Riggs for a long, long time.
Now, you can imagine that the mixture of Carl Menninger and David Rapaport was a strange one. You would not have predicted that these two people would ever get together. Carl Menninger was a Midwestern moralist who preached good works, optimism. His idea was that if you had good psychiatric treatment, you would emerge weller than well, was what he said. And David Rapaport was a Talmudist who didn't want surface stuff. He wanted to dive below the surface and to dive deeper and deeper and to analyze and parse and so on and so forth. Yet these two people seemed to play off each other. And the Menninger Clinic thrived, I think, because of this kind of unpredictable dialectic that was there. And it was a dialectic. And we were the lucky synthesis of that. He taught us the metapsychological papers, including Chapter 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This was not in the Psychoanalytic Institute. This was a course that he taught. And it went on for a year, and just as Roy described it, if you said that Freud said such and such, he would say where? And you would have to come up with the chapter and verse. And there was no fooling around here. And if you screwed it up, that was the end. I mean, he wrote you off because you were, and even though he could do that to himself and say, bluff, he could tell if you were bluffing. The last thing that I want to say about this, because I think I've gone on long enough, is that his analysis of the rationale, say, of the Wechsler, I mentioned I thought was an extraordinary thing. I'm sure that Roy participated in this and made it what it really was. My own work has centered on schizophrenic thinking and the neurobiology of schizophrenia. And we've made good use of the quality of the thought disorder that is characteristic of schizophrenia as distinguished from, say, mania or right hemisphere dysfunctions. And we know that there are different kinds of cognitive dysfunctions in schizophrenia. And Roy's book makes that clear. Rapaport's analysis makes that clear. I recently attended a conference in Washington where the pharmaceutical companies proposed that they fashion a drug that will target the cognitive dysfunction of schizophrenia, distinguished from the psychotic disorganization. And they wanted to come up with a single score which their compound would target. And my entire training came back to me, and I said, there is no such thing. There are many different kinds of cognitive dysfunctions. Concentration, there's attention, there's, and I went down the rationales of the waste and so on. But it wasn't known as the waste then, the WB. And that kind of held the day. And this is the kind of work that we do. We do test memory and different kinds of memory. And that is very different from the long-term retention, and so on and so forth. And that the pharmaceutical companies are whistling Dixie if they think that they can come up with a happy pill that's going to address that. Yeah.
Oh, they'll come up with it, yes.
Well, but I think that the FDA will stop them. Because the assistant head of the FDA came over to me and he said, I want to hear that again. Tell me about that. I said, look, psychosis is different from thought disorder. And I had to go down and explain this to him. And that was a major experience for him.
With this FDA, are you out of your mind?
I think this is a Democratic holdover.
Phil, thank you very much.